Everyone wants to know where their food comes from, and we need to be open and honest and have a clear communication with the consumer. Ohio has led the industry in talking to consumers and sharing our story. And that work is not done. And we are protecting a food supply.
Welcome to Unplucked, the official podcast of the Poultry Science Association. This is the podcast where we strip away the fluff and get real about poultry science from bench to barn. I'm your host, Andy Vance, Executive Director of the Poultry Science Association. In this week's episode, we sit down with a longtime friend of mine, Jim Chakeres, Executive Vice President of the Ohio Poultry Association. Jim has been a trusted voice in agriculture for more than 2 decades and has been intimately involved in the poultry industry and its growth in a state. And a lot of people may not realize this, but the Buckeye State is one of the most significant poultry production states in the country. We're kind of quiet about that, Jim, in a lot of ways, that people don't realize how big poultry is here in a very diverse poultry industry. He wears many hats at OPA, from guiding farmers through the evolving biosecurity demands on farm to speaking with members of the local press about disease outbreaks, advocating for the industry at the state level for science-based policy affecting poultry production. Whether Jim's around the barn, in the newsroom, at the State House, he brings clarity and leadership to every conversation. So this week we wanted to talk with somebody who's working on the ground, supporting producers about the challenges of avian influenza, the importance of consumer trust, and how leaders can help producers adapt, connect, and thrive. Jim, let's get started. How did you get engaged with the poultry industry to begin with? And what's kept you engaged in coming to the office excited every day these many years?
Well, Andy, it's a pleasure to be here and to share our story here at Ohio Poultry. I look back on my career, and agriculture has always been my roots. I grew up on a small farm, had extended family with larger farms. And, as I look back on it, I was very heavily engaged in more of our red meat production. But prior to coming to the Ohio Poultry Association, I had a stint at the Ohio Farm Bureau. Of course, many know me from the sheep and wool industry, where I was a strong advocate for that. But as I got to know the poultry people, I looked at their passion and what animal agriculture looked like in the future, and there was an opportunity at poultry. And so I kind of threw my hat in the ring and have just flourished here, and I enjoy working with the people. That's what keeps me coming energized every day and advocating and fighting for this industry are the farmers, the people that are associated with our industry, our allied industry. Everyone shares a common passion for providing this safe, wholesome food that America and the world needs. And so that's what drives me.
I love that. And I think a lot of us who work in the association space share that. I always say people don't join associations, they join people. And so I think that you make a great case there. Looking at, and I alluded to this in your introduction, that Ohio's poultry industry is more significant than the average person probably realizes. Would you talk about that a minute and give some dimension for people who aren't as steeped in the stats or the data? Because I also think it's a very diverse poultry industry in Ohio. It's not just one type of production or production system or species that we raise here.
Sure. I mean, obviously, people think of Ohio and they think of eggs because we have a strong tradition in egg production. And our ranking in eggs over the past 5 years has gone from 1 to 3, depending on current crises that may be affecting the industry. And so that's an industry that continues to grow, and I think it starts here in the heartland where we've got good corn production, we've got good work ethic and family values, and we are fortunate that we are close to so many major metro markets.
Mhm.
So it makes sense for poultry production and egg production to be centered here, if you will. On top of the eggs, then we have a very robust turkey industry in Ohio, primarily located in west central Ohio, bordering on Indiana, and Ohio growers or companies share some growers in Indiana. And we rank in terms of turkey production anywhere between 7th to 9th. And it depends on whether you look at the number of birds produced or the pounds that we produce, because we tend to raise a heavier turkey here in Ohio because the vast majority of our turkeys, I'm going to say 96 plus are further processed.
Hmm.
So think deli meat, turkey burgers, roasts, those type of things. But we also have great niche marketers in the turkey business, specialty markets. So there's something there for everyone. And then we flip that over to the eastern side of the state where we do see some egg production, but we also find our broiler industry is centered there. And we've got a couple of companies over there that work with many different family farms in producing many broiler chickens for not only the meat case in your grocery store, but also the restaurants that you tend to frequent.
Yeah, it's one of the things or when you were talking about the reasons why the egg industry has been such an integral part of Ohio's overall agriculture industry. I mean, I remember years ago, I'm like you, I came up on the red meat side of things, and Fred Daly, as director of agriculture for so long, used to say, "Man, we've got to produce food here because we are within an easy truck drive of 60% of the U.S. population, whatever the actual number is, and so it's really logical that we would produce eggs here and get them to market very efficiently." As you have led this association for more than 20 years, I'm curious to see what changes you've seen in the overall industry or poultry production during that time. From a long range view, how is the industry of today different from the one you were representing when you first came into the office?
I look at a couple of different areas where I see major growth and change within the industry. And first is communicating and sharing our story with consumers. Everyone wants to know where their food comes from, and we need to be open and honest and have a clear communication with the consumer. And I think that Ohio has led the industry in talking to consumers and sharing our story. And so I think that's one way that we continue to evolve, and that work is not done. We need to continue to evolve and change in the way that people want their information today, and we've tried to adapt and we will continue to do so. I think the other way that we have grown is adapting to, which ties into your members, the science that's out there.
Hmm.
How have we grown? How has efficiency improved? And how has sustainability improved? For example, we use so much less water and energy per unit of protein than we did 20, 30, 50 years ago. To me, it's very dynamic within our industry. Perhaps the vertical integration helps make that happen quicker. But I also think that provides us with more information to share with our consumers and to tell our story.
Yeah, and I think that adaptability, we had a recent guest on, we were talking about growth of broilers, the literal growth of chickens, and we were talking about how much more efficiently today's bird is turning feed into gain. That's a lot of what you're talking about, the technology that we have there to produce more grams of protein more sustainably is fascinating. So you as you talk about that idea of changing and embracing change and being adaptable, how do we help support producers in adapting to new systems, technologies, the challenges? What advice might you have there about ways we can successfully support producers in evolving and continuing to meet those challenges?
When I look at that, I think that's a somewhat of a delicate question because I think it is a true balance because we have very brilliant researchers out there that have great ideas about how the industry could change and improve. But we also at the same time need those researchers to be good listeners and listen to the greater poultry community about what they need. And so I think again, it becomes down to that balance. Bring us new ideas, but listen to what concerns we have and then figure out how you may plug into that equation and provide answers. And so I think that is step one.
Hmm.
Step two is sharing the information, not just to industry, but be that expert spokesperson when we need to come to someone to talk about food safety or nutrition or HPAI, whatever that may be. We need those third party experts because we know that consumers trust those that are affiliated, especially with universities. And so I think that's something that comes with the science, bring us what we need, but then let's figure out how to way we can share that together.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk more about the trust and transparency because you have always been a great advocate for that in agriculture generally. So I want to come back to that in a little bit. Let's dive in a little bit on something that I know you have been dealing with as kind of frontline, top of mind for a few years now, and that's avian influenza. During an event like an AI outbreak, how do we balance, or how do you maybe specifically balance this idea of urgency? We've got to respond quickly. It's a rapidly evolving situation with transparency and then being accurate when you're talking to whether it's media, government officials, other stakeholders outside of the industry.
I think we have to realize that no matter who we are talking to and what part of a response to something like an avian influenza outbreak it is, we have to address and recognize and talk about the human component. And so I think that's one role, especially where the association comes into play. Obviously, it is a critical response on the farm, and there are certain things that have to be done, but there are also people on that farm. And we also need to figure out how we take care of those people and support those people. We also have to realize that those farms have customers, and how can we help them respond to their customers? And those customers have consumers that are our consumers. Basically, we're sharing that same message of caring, but we may tailor the messages slightly in terms or emotions that each of those different groups may hear better, if you will. And so those are the deliverables that we try to work through and to support farms and consumers. But at the end of the day, there's no hiding, there's no covering up. This is what's happening. A lot of the issues that surrounded HPAI with consumers dealt with prices. And so to explain that pricing to a consumer, that egg farms are price takers, they're not price makers.
Mhm.
And so how can we share that message in commonly accepted language that makes a consumer understand the situation? And to a certain extent, share the feelings and the empathy of what's going on within the industry when these type of things happen. And I think it's also important to understand that we're doing this for a greater good, and we are protecting a food supply. And so those are all things that I think we have to craft into messages that we share with many, many different audiences.
Yeah, and we certainly had gotten called upon by some local media to talk about what was happening with, say, depopulating flocks, and it was interesting to see how do consumers react to price versus concerns they might have had about animal welfare implications of how we manage this disease. And really, I think was a good reminder for me that people are complicated in a lot of ways. So when you're looking at how a consumer responds, for most people it is, hey, we were very price sensitive because everybody's got to eat, and how do they respond to that? On the other hand, I might have a neighbor down the street that was like, well, why are farmers doing X? Did you have any surprises when you were going through, and as you continue to go through high path AI and answering media questions and dealing with consumers, any surprises for you? Or did people by and large, and then when I say people, I mean consumers maybe and reporters, respond the way you would have anticipated?
I think for the most part, everyone responded. They might not necessarily have liked what they heard. And you're always going to have those reporters that are going to continue to dig and still do, but always looking for more. I think that's the mass media environment we live in today's world. But for the most part, I think people understood. And people, while they weren't maybe necessarily happy about the situation, at least they could comprehend what was happening and there was an explanation provided to them. Sometimes the simpler we keep that message and break it down into terms that they understand and can use, it works. And they also need to be reassured that food safety is important. Your eggs, chicken, and turkey remain safe to eat. What carefully crafted messages are we sharing with people?
Mhm.
What are we working through? Because everyone just wants to be reassured.
That's right.
And what is the human side of this? And so that I think is important in where we fit in. And then also providing our farms and members with the information that they can share to people when they talk to, as you said, your neighbor down the street, or maybe it's the newlyweds down the road, or whatever that may be. We all come into contact with those people. And so how can we make sure that everyone is sharing the right information in the right format? And so I think that's where we come into activating within an outbreak situation.
Let's shift from kind of the communication side of this to on farm. I want to talk about biosecurity for a minute because you deal with producers, and as we talked about at the top of the program, a very diverse poultry industry in the state. And so biosecurity looks different on commercial scale egg farm than it does on a turkey farm than it does on maybe a niche broiler type of operation. What today is the state of biosecurity from your standpoint? What have we learned over the past 3 or 4 years of dealing with this, and how do you feel producers have responded to the need for evolving, improving biosecurity practices on the farm?
I think that across the board within the poultry industry, and I will speak to Ohio, but I think it goes beyond our state borders. Biosecurity within the poultry sector is, I used to say enhanced. It has gone beyond that to where we have implemented, often at great cost to these farms, many new practices, new technology, new infrastructure on these farms to with the sole mission of protecting the birds and protecting the food supply. And so, again, I think this is where your members come into play, a lot of the technology they provide and how we can then implement that on the farm,
Mhm.
making us aware of what that could be. What can we try? How can we field test things? What do we need to do? So I think biosecurity is ever present, and we are constantly at that heightened state where we have implemented the highest level truck washes, shower in, shower out. There are so many different things that we have done on the farms, but then we also continue to identify what potential weaknesses there may be in that structure and how can we address them. We have promoted through the Ohio Poultry Association participation in not only the 14-point biosecurity audits, but also the wildlife biosecurity assessments and the enhanced biosecurity BCAP audits for several different people. And I think Ohio has one of the highest rates of participation in those. And so I'm proud of my farms for taking that extra measure. And they want to protect their birds because I always kind of work it into every interview that I do that poultry farmers wake up every morning. And one of the first things they think about is caring for their birds. Because if those birds are not viable and healthy and productive, that's the weakest link in the chain. So we've got to make sure that the bird comes first. And so I think that is the driving force behind everything that we do, but in particular, biosecurity.
Yeah, I'm convinced, Jim, and I think you make a strong argument for this, that everybody I've met who works in food animal production got into it because they genuinely love animals. And I don't know if people really get that until they deal with. I use the example of our president of our board, a longtime faculty member at the University of Alberta. His name's Doug Korber. He's out in private consulting practice now. Every time I travel with Doug works in a day to go bird watching. Doug genuinely loves birds, not just chickens. That's where he's done most of his work as an academic, but he genuinely loves birds. My wife jokes we got into dogs in our family because I can't keep heifers in the backyard in Bexley, Ohio. So I transplanted my love of purebred cattle to purebred dog. Like the story you tell there, right, every day the farmer getting up or the researcher getting up or the veterinarian getting up to go care for the birds. That's a real thing that I'm not sure the average person outside of the industry gets until they get to know people like your members, my members, and so on. I want to stick with this biosecurity thing for a moment and ask, so when you talked about continuing to evolve and the new technologies, are there gaps that you see today or that you're concerned about, or biosecurity practices that you think we need to see more widespread, or barriers that you would see to adoption of enhanced, increased practices? And it can be just more broadly as you talk with other state executives and so on. But are there areas where you think, hey, we need to collectively take another step?
Well, I think we need to maybe look at things from the 30,000 feet level to a certain extent, because I think we need to look at the greater poultry industry and maybe look at concentrations in different parts of the country. And what does the density of poultry in those areas look like? And so in Western Ohio, we have farms that are very close together. So, what does biosecurity look like there compared to farms in the West or other parts of the United States that may be far from their neighbors? And so, what can we do there in terms of really looking at how we can stop an introduction of a virus, or how do we stop the spread?
Hmm.
I think that's one thing that we need to definitely look at. Kind of coupled with that is there's a lot of interest in airborne transmission and how does the virus survive? What is the mechanism that it would enter a secure, biosecure poultry building? I think those are a couple of things that stand out in my mind in terms of how we look at this, especially coming off of the Ohio outbreak last year and what we've learned from that or what we still need to learn from that.
Hmm.
And I think there are a few unanswered questions.
Yeah, the work continues. And that's I always say one of the things I love about scientific research is you could almost at the end of every journal article ever say, recommendations, more research needed. And certainly this is an area where more to learn, continue to evolve. Great example. I want to drill in. I mentioned earlier we'd get back into public engagement and transparency because I think you're such a great resource on this and a great example. So you made a very strong case earlier about the importance of trust and transparency as part of that. If you were giving advice to producers, to researchers, to other industry leaders about how to connect directly with consumers and build trust, what's some advice you would have for them on making that connection?
I think it's all about establishing a mindset that you're willing to share your story. You're willing to tell what you do. I look back historically, farmers are some of the most humble people that exist in society. But in today's world, if you don't tell your story, you're going to get left behind. And so we need to embrace that and not be afraid to share what we do and be extremely genuine and open and honest about what you're saying. The other thing is, I think that every successful campaign, conversation, whatever, needs a hook to kind of sometimes act as that catalyst. For me, that is food
Yeah.
because we all eat. So I kind of like delve into that culinary side of things. And if I can gain a consumer's trust by recipes or cooking techniques or whatever we do, then I've got an audience that's going to listen when I want to talk about nutrition or food safety or what's going on today's farms in terms of sustainability and environment. And then when there is an issue or a concern with a disease like avian influenza, how can we share that story as well? And I suppose I've carried this with me my entire career. I look at going back to when I was working with lamb and wool. And part of the challenge there is people don't eat a lot of lamb. And not a lot of restaurants are have featuring lamb on the menu for everyday dining. And so there really wasn't anyone to even start demonstrating or talking about that. So I grew up in a family that ate lamb and we all cooked. And so I kind of honed those cooking skills and kind of started with a lamb cooking show and we started developing consumer interest and trust. And so I've kind of amplified that now within the poultry world. And I'm extremely proud of our very robust consumer outreach program all across several different platforms.
And we're going to talk about those in a second, but I want to commend you for that too, Jim, because I think that hook, I've said it myself for years, we all got to eat. And so that's something we can bond over. But I also think too, your point earlier, we were talking about researchers listening to producers. I think that's a good example of listening to customers and consumers. If we have a tasty eating experience, we've been talking a lot about high path, but we could easily be talking about woody breast and some of the other related issues. Like, hey, if we listen to the customer, give them an even more enjoyable eating experience, connect with them in that way. That's a two-way street that I think is having the conversations that you and I are having that helps build trust with consumers and maybe carries that back to the producer, the researcher, and so on. You talked about your social media campaigns. I mean, I know you've also had some great success partnering with Ohio State Athletics to meet customers there. Obviously, it helps having the number one football team, in the country to attach your campaign to. But give some insight examples of what's worked well for you in reaching and educating the public through some of those partnerships and social media efforts that you've used.
I think we have learned over the years through our partnership with Ohio State Athletics, and kind of some of that has evolved. And so we kind of make a big splash with ohioeggs.com sponsors the fourth quarter replays on the big jumbotron in the football stadium, and then also at hockey games, men's and women's basketball. So we're pretty broad spectrum there. But it goes further than that because we've engaged on their digital platforms. As we see more and more people looking at where they get their information and where they follow the Ohio State University athletics, it's, becomes more digital all the time. And so we've had good success there and engagement. We've been able to track that and look at return on investment now. And also engaging some tools like the Ohio State Buckeyes Facebook page, where we do a recipe every Friday before the game. And we've had a recipe that actually, I don't know that this is the correct term, but broke the Facebook page and kind of shut it down for a while because we had so many hits on that. So those are some things that have worked well for us. Most recently, we kind of went into that NIL partnership. And just a couple of weeks ago, we filmed an NIL partnership in the Ohio Poultry Association offices here in our kitchen. And I had two brothers, they're twins, that are offensive linemen for the Buckeyes, about 6'5" and 6'6" or 7, I think, come in the office and cook with two brothers that are engaged in the egg business, the Rindler brothers. So they made each other breakfast and talked about their shared values and working with family and hard work and ethics and what's important to them within their own respective areas. So it was almost like you drew a comparison between egg farming and football. And so it kind of made it more real. And then they left here and went to Ohio Stadium and talked there for a while. And so I think it's interesting the connections you make, and I'm really excited about seeing the final edit on that and sharing that in the next few days as we progress in the football season. And we're coming into our biggest egg consumption period of the year. And so I think we're kind of gonna have two big highlights happening here all at once.
It's a great lesson living in Big Ten country, but then also, of course, quite a lot of our members and listeners will be in SEC country, so passionate about university athletics, where the birds are grown. It's a natural partnership. And I think the story you tell there as a dad, right? Why do I want my kid raising animals? Why do I want my kid playing sports? Because the values and the discipline and the hard work. And so the idea that there's something bigger than yourself, I think really does come through in both those walks of life, competitive athletics and animal care and production. So really, really great lessons, Jim. As you're looking at being that bridge between the producer and the public that you serve in that association role and that advocacy role, what's the biggest challenge you run into on a regular basis in trying to be that intermediary, that voice, that connection between those two camps that maybe share a lot of values, but are sometimes at tension as well?
I think it comes down to feeling comfortable talking to everyone, willing to share your story. One of the things we do in agriculture, sometimes we talk too much. And I think you have to learn when not to comment or not to engage or to wait and engage at the right time. Because sometimes we stir the pot and keep a conversation going when the news cycle is done. And so I think that was one of the biggest lessons that I learned. And sometimes I think it's hard to convince someone that's so excited about what they want to do, and we have convinced them to share their message. But sometimes we just need to learn about when we need to talk and how we engage. So I'm all for transparency. I'm 100% into sharing our message, but let's find the right time to do it and recognize that there may be some wrong times.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great reminder. Early in my career as a journalist, the animal rights movement was super active and engaged. And oftentimes I wondered, like, are we doing them a favor by giving them oxygen when In reality, 95% of consumers are buying food based on cost, taste. I'm going to buy what I like if I can afford to do it. And are we amplifying people that don't have our best interest at heart just because we feel compelled to say something
Yeah.
all the time? And man, that's a great reminder, Jim. As I want to take this conversation maybe into the future space for a minute as the landscape continues to shift, whether it's production reality, some of the things you and I were talking about earlier, as the industry evolves, as consumer trends continue to evolve, as disease threats change. God knows we haven't even talked about the policy landscape, and it's such a dynamic geopolitical environment that we're in today. How do we stay ahead of some of these emerging issues? What advice do you have for your members, our members, the industry more generally, about how we stay ahead of the curve as much as we can, stay engaged, and be proactive?
As I look at how we evolve, how we change, how we continue to lift our industry up into the leadership roles that we want, share of that consumer dollar, however you want to measure that.
Hmm.
I think it all comes down to you have to be engaged and we have to commit to being lifelong learners. We have to listen. We have to listen to each other. We have to learn. We have to change. We have to evolve. Because if we don't, then I think that is something that we have to really take a step back and realize that this is a barrier. And how do we identify those and move forward? To me, one of the proudest accomplishments we did at a certain time here at the Ohio Poultry Association was back in 2016 to 18, we put in a leadership development program. And it was kind of turned into kind of a succession planning because the vast majority of our poultry companies here in Ohio are family owned. And that time frame caught that next generation just as they were coming into business. So to me, did we provide them with tools to help them prepare to run their companies? Yes. But the greater thing to me is we developed and cultivated relationships and networking. And so now they pick up the phone and they call each other. And so I think not only did we contribute to succession planning, we created a viable network for success within those future generations. And so I look at that and I think that's a prime example of how our industry is going to succeed. And we're going to build on the strengths and we're going to embrace new people coming into our industry to make us better. And at the end of the day, that makes the products we produce that much better.
What an inspiring story, Jim. I'd almost like to end it there, but I'm going to ask you one last question before we wrap up. Because you talk with producers on a daily basis, if you were going to give one piece of advice for the scientists listening to us about how they could better communicate with the producer, build a relationship. You just talked about the power of relationships. What advice would you give the scientist, the researcher, the extension professional? They probably already have the answers to this, so maybe I shouldn't lump them in there. But the average, let's say, university faculty member or somebody working at a company and tech service space, if you could give them some advice for connecting with the producer and building relationships, what advice would you give?
I think first and foremost, again, I kind of the thread through this whole conversation today, it comes down to communication and talk and listen to the producers, the people that you come in contact with. Use your state associations. We are often closely connected with the consumers. And to me, if the Ohio State University came to me and said, let's set up an evening together where the poultry researchers can sit down and talk to the producers, that's the future.
Mhm.
And so those type of things need to be cultivated. And maybe that falls back to the association to be the catalyst to make that happen. Maybe it's the institution. Let's figure out how we can work together to share that. So at the end of the day, we get calls or emails from researchers all the time wanting us to provide a letter of support for this grant, or we would like to test this on a farm. Well, if you haven't engaged with farmers before that, it makes that so much more difficult. And so let's figure out how we can share our combined goals for the betterment of the industry. and let's learn what each other does. Because at the end of the day, I'm not sure that I know what all the researchers do, what their projects are, what their interests are, how are they funded, what do they need, what do they need access to. Let's just open that dialogue. And to me, that would be a big first step.
I'm glad I asked that question because that is the perfect place to end the conversation. Well said, Jim. Thank you for that insight. And thank you for all you do in the community locally, but also you're a tremendous leader in the industry more broadly and engaging with your fellow state executives. I know you occupy a really important leadership role there and nationally. So thank you for doing what you do on a daily basis and for engaging with us here and being part of the conversation. Friends, if you've enjoyed this conversation, and you're not already a subscriber, I would encourage you to do that. Find Unplucked wherever you listen to your podcast. If you missed any episode, you can go to poultryscience.org, go to the podcast page, and go back and listen to previous episodes. And if you have an idea for a future episode, why, drop us a line, give us a suggestion, a topic, or a guest you think we should engage with. Always looking for ideas and individuals to connect with. A quick heads up, next week will be our last episode before the holiday break as we come into the holidays. We're going to take a brief hiatus in December and early January. We will be back with new episodes starting January 21st. We have one more episode next week, and then we'll be back after the holidays. So I want to thank Lindsay Johnston, our producer, for work on this episode. Our editor and engineer is Mike Lunt of Parasol. I'm Andy Vance for the Poultry Science Association. We'll see you next week.